Thank you for joining us for this special presentation from Dr. Leroy Hopkins. The title of this presentation is called, Over There, African American World War I Veterans from Salisbury Township and the Gap Area. We would like to take a moment and thank our corporate sponsors, White Chimneys and Gap Self-Storage, as well as all of those who generously donate to help preserve the history of Salisbury Township. Thank you. Please welcome Dr. Leroy Hopkins.
The title is Over There, World War I Veterans from Salisbury Township and the Gap Area. My interest in World War I began when I discovered that my uncle, Rodney Isaac Pico, was a Buffalo soldier who served in the 24th Infantry from 1914 to 1919. My mother had a photo of her brother posing with other men in his military Masonic lodge. I also recalled hearing that my grandfather had had to raise money to get Uncle Rodney out of some unspecified difficulty. Years later, I made two discoveries. First, the reprint of the 1932 publication, a record of the officers, enlisted men, and nurses of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in the World War, 1917 to 1918. My second discovery I found online, a subpoena for my uncle. His regiment was involved in the Houston race riot of August 23, 1917. The all-black regiment ran afoul of Jim Crow Houston, and after several provocations by Houston police, some of the men went to the camp arsenal, took weapons, and marched upon the city, seeking revenge. In the following melee, 16 civilians, 5 policemen, and 4 soldiers were killed. Once order was restored, civilian juries deliberated over the fate of the accused 19. 19 were executed and 41 were sentenced to life imprisonment. This incident and the Brownsville incident of August 1906, in which members of the 25th Infantry were probably falsely accused of killing a white resident, substantiated official prejudices against blacks in the military. Although African Americans had served with valor under fire in every American war, their participation was initially questioned and then condemned after the fact. The Buffalo Soldier Regiments, 24th and 25th Infantry, and the 9th and 10th Cavalry had proved themselves in the Indian Wars after 1865, in Puerto Rico and Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and also in the campaign along the Mexican border against Pancho Villa. But because of Brownsville and Houston, it was decided not to send seasoned veterans abroad. Instead, the military drafted state militias and thousands of civilians who were poorly trained and equipped. The intent was to use African Americans solely as manual laborers. The only reason that the units such as the 369th, the famous Harlem Hellfighters, experienced combat was that General Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, acceded to French requests to replenish their military units depleted by years of intense combat. Under French command, this regiment was honored by the French with the Croix de Guerre for bravery and meritorious service. But back to the local scene. The aforementioned 1932 publication was the result of a celebration of the summer of 1919, welcoming the returning veterans. The celebration was not without controversy. The mayor of Lancaster had appointed a committee to plan the event, but no black voices were included. The Negro Civic League of Southeastern Pennsylvania, led by Reverend F.T.M. Webster of Lancaster's Bethel AME Church, protested publicly against this exclusion or oversight. Perhaps as a mollifying gesture, a separate program was conducted in Lancaster's Buchanan Park on August 14, 1919, that featured a sing-along of patriotic and inspirational songs. Although a decision was made in 1919 to publish a list of the male and female veterans of the war, the project was delayed, according to publishers, for a number of years because military histories were being published and official sources such as the Records Division of the Adjutant General's Office in Harrisburg and the Adjutant General's Office of the War Department in Washington, D.C. had to be consulted. True to the racial tenor of the time, a separate list was made of Black veterans. and is especially this list that causes some difficulties of anyone that is familiar to anyone who has consulted the Office of Veterans Affairs in the county courthouse. Information on veterans is self-reported. Also, a veteran who enlisted outside of the state and then retired to this state is not necessarily identified as a veteran. For the purposes of this essay, I want to focus on the veterans identified as originating from this area, from the Salisbury Township and Gap area. From the published list, we find James L. Boot, RFD number 2, New Holland, a wagoneer. James L. Boot, RFD number 2, New Holland, private in Camp Green in North Carolina. Milford Dennis from Welsh Mountain, private in the 859th Company. Albert Dickinson from 9 Points. Melvin Hgler, New Holland. John D. Hopkins, Christiana. Ezekiel H. Miller, Christiana, and John H. Miller, Christiana. Also, Oliver C. Miller, Bartville. Harvard Stewart from the Gap, and Frank B. Thompson from Octorara. From a June 2nd, 1920 report in the Lancaster Intelligencer on the installation of a tablet in New Holland dedicated to World War I veterans, we find 2 additional names, Cyrus Toogood and Howard Toogood. Also, a letter published on August 14th, 1918, addressed to the Christiana Draft Board titled, Colored Men Proud to Serve in the Army. This letter was signed by John D. Hopkins and Sherman Miller. So there's also a Sherman Miller that should be included on the list. Through Ancestry.com, I was able to find the following about Sherman Miller. He was born on March 4th, 1891 in Christiana. His parents were Whitmer Miller and Isabella Craig. He achieved the rank of private in Company B of a division battalion. In 1934, his father applied for his military pension because Sherman Lewis Miller died on January 30th, 1923 from pneumonia and was buried in Ackland, presumably at Mount Zion AME Church. I would like to provide similar information on a couple of other veterans. The Melford H. Hgler listed is not the famous preacher from the Welsh Mountain, but his son by his second wife, Mary Marshall Hgler. Official records demonstrate how precarious orthography often is. Private Hagler's first name is variously Melford, M-E-L-F-O-R-D, or Milford, M-I-L-F-O-R-D. Both he and his parents are buried in the Peckway Presbyterian Cemetery in Gap. The younger Hgler died on June 4th, 1984. His mother died on December 8th, 1925, and the attending physician was none other than Dr. Walter D. Blankenship, my mother's employer in the 1950s, and in part responsible for my applying to Millersville State College to study. He was a trustee at Millersville. The Millers were brothers. Ezekiel was born in 1890 and John in 1895. Ezekiel was probably one of the few of the local recruits who was directly involved in combat. He served in an artillery regiment. The laborers could, however, also come under fire. During the Meuse-Argonne campaign of September 26th to November 11th, 1918, the labor battalions found themselves constantly under attack by the Germans. Both brothers survived the war. Ezekiel's death is not documented. John died in 1975. Their father William died in July of 1932. John lived in Bart, but Ezekiel was listed as living in Switzerland. When John died on February 23rd, 1975, he was buried at Mount Zion AME Church in Ackland. Now, since I did this, I found some more information about Ezekiel Harry Miller. He not only went to Howard University, he was a graduate when the war began. After the war, he got a master's degree from Columbia University. And in the Crisis magazine, which was published by W.B. Du Bois and was the chief organ of the NAACP, it mentions in 1921 that he received a fellowship of $1,500 a year so that he could work on his doctoral dissertation. At some point, I don't know yet, but at some point he received a PhD from the University of Dijon in France. I have not yet ascertained as yet if there is a family connection to Oliver C. Miller, whose birth date is variously given as June 22nd, 1889 and 1893. He died on February 21st, 1945, and was buried at Mount Zion at Glen. A late friend of mine from Christiana, Oswald Miller, sent me a letter many years ago in which the adventures of Aunt Jenny Craig were outlined. There may be a connection to Sherman Miller's mother, Isabella Craig, but that remains for further research. And the Aunt Jenny Craig was apparently a slave on George Washington's plantation. Equally challenging is another name closely tied to this region, Boots. The Boots family is a wide-ranging clan of interesting people. My aunt's sister-in-law, Harriet Elizabeth Brodus, married Clarence Boots. All of my childhood and early adult life was spent in contact with members of that extended family. I have a niece and nephew named Monique and Nicole Boots. They are all related to the Boots of this region. James Israel Boots was born on September 7th, 1892 in New Holland. His parents are listed as Charlie Smith and Mary Boots. We find him in 1910 on Welsh Mountain in the household of Betsy Boots, widow of Civil War veteran Arthur Boots. James is listed as her nephew. More familiar is James Lewis Boots, who was born July 12, 1896 and died October 1st, 1973. His parents are John W. Boots and Elizabeth Min Boots. James' brother, John M. Boots, had a son named Clarence, who married the aforementioned Harriet Elizabeth Brodus, my aunt's sister-in-law. The complexity of family relationships in this area is hinted at by the Boots family. It becomes even more complicated when considering Howard and Cyrus Toogood. A curious note is added by a report in the Intelligencer Journal of January 7th, 1925. The funeral of Howard Moore, colored native of the Welsh Mountain Mission, known in that district as Howard Toogood, was held on January 6th at Mount Hope Chapel. This Howard Toogood is, however, not the World War I veteran. Jacob Howard Frederick Lewis Toogood was born on November 30th, 1888, the son of James Toogood and Rachel Watson Lockard Toogood. Cyrus Toogood was his brother, born in 1892. It is perhaps a commentary of family life that Cyrus is listed in the 1910 census as living on Welsh Mountain with his grandmother, Lydia Ann Watson. Genealogy is an exacting science, but thanks to Linda B. Rouse, I have seen across connections between the Green, Boots, Book, and other families found in rural Lancaster County. A family which has often been identified with my own is that of John David Hopkins. He was born in Quarryville on January 6, 1894. His parents were Alfred and Anna Mary Wilson. His brother was Reverend Jacob Ambrose Hopkins, a close friend of my family. To add to the confusion, my father was born in East Drumore in 1908 and had an older brother named John Hopkins, who moved to the Midwest sometime after World War I. He's not the same person as John David Hopkins. Reverend Ambrose Hopkins' nephew and I have never met, but we have the same allergist and pulmonary physician. His name is Leroy D. Hopkins, and I'm Leroy T. Hopkins. But back to John. His obituary, published in the Intelligencer Journal on August 18, 1960, provides more information that is available for other veterans. John D. Hopkins graduated from Bard High School and Lincoln University and did graduate work at Columbia University. He taught for 38 years, and in a story from 1933, he bore the title of professor. He was a trustee of the Shiloh Baptist Church in Trenton, New Jersey, and was active in the American Legion Post and the Boy Scouts. Further research reveals that Hopkins taught at the Lincoln School in Trenton, a segregated school revived in 1923 and finally integrated in 1946. Little is known about the two veterans on my list, Harvard Stewart and Frank B. Thompson. Stewart is interesting in that he enlisted into the Army on September 29, 1917 in Newport News, Virginia. According to his pension application in 1934, he lived in Gap. Frank B. Thompson is another puzzle. He was born in Octorara on March 31st, 1893. When he was inducted on April 26, 1918, he was living in Harrisburg, where he was employed as a cook. According to compensation files, he resided in Octorara from 1934 to 1948, but according to a death certificate, he died on April 25th, 1920 from pulmonary pneumonia. His profession is listed as soldier. It is likely a family member applied for the pension. Since writing this, I discovered that Frank B. Thompson is a descendant of the Thompson involved in the Christiana Resistance of 1851. And his cousin, Darlene Colon, is a member of our historical society. That's the African American Historical Society of South Central Pennsylvania. And she's also I believe she's still president of the Christiana Historical Society. The final veteran that I would like to mention is Milton Dennis. Facts about his life mirror perhaps the conditions in his community. He was born in Springville, and when he was drafted, he was apparently unable to write his name. He stated that his date of birth was unknown, but asserted that he was born in 1889. His death certificate states that he was born on August 24th, 1892, the son of Adam Dennis and Lousanna Boots. When he joined the military, he lived in Elverson and stated that his wife was Mary, maiden name King. His death certificate, however, states that his widow is Amanda Moore. When he died on September 14, 1935, he was buried at Mount Hope. To appreciate the service rendered by these veterans, it is important to examine the era in which they lived. Eminent historian Rayford Logan has described this period from the end of Reconstruction to the 1920s as the nadir, a low point in race relations characterized by Jim Crow and mob violence in the South and overt racism and discrimination in the North. Logan experienced this himself during his service in World War I. Unlike others, he did not return immediately after war to confront the violence of the Red Summer, but stayed in France. World War I was a turning point in racial relations in this country, in that it unleashed unprecedented violence against Black Americans, but was also the crucible for what some term the new Negro, a self-sufficient individual concerned about racial uplift and achieving justice and equality before the law. Lancaster County was not immune to the negativity that permeated American society on racial matters after Reconstruction. From a high point of 3,650 individuals in 1860, by 1910, the county's Black population had fallen to 2,299, of which 803 lived in Lancaster City. Those African Americans who were employed were primarily to be found doing menial labor. Few were as fortunate as John Hopkins in pursuing an academic career, or like Ezekiel Miller. Some moved to other areas, such as Frank B. Thompson, drawn by the forces of urbanization that drew multitudes of African Americans, not only from the South, but also in the North to the North's urban centers. Economic necessity and an acute housing shortage facilitated the growth of centers of poverty. From the 1830s to the 1950s, local newspapers regularly carried stories about criminal activity and depravity in enclaves such as Columbia's Toe Hill, Lancaster's Fagleyville, and 7th Ward, as well as Welsh Mountain. The reasons for this criminal activity are seldom examined. It is assumed that such activity is a natural trait of the Blacks and whites living in poverty. Special scorn and consternation is aroused by incidents in which the races interact too freely. That is a leitmotif in stories about Welsh Mountain, and especially regarding the persons involved in the murder of Arthur Moyer in 1927. Poverty and violence feed off each other, and long-held antipathies for African Americans that permeate our social structure have made violent outbursts such as lynchings or race riots an everyday danger. There is no record of how Black residents of Salisbury Township reacted to the lynching of Zach Walker just over the Chester County line in August of 1911. The shock must have been considerable. Yet just a few years later, residents of the area went off to fight to save the world for democracy. It is well known how badly African Americans were treated in the military, but yet they did not balk in great numbers about joining. This was not just blind patriotism, but a belief in a system in which had little use for them as individuals. That is the remarkable story of African Americans in the history of our military, and World War I was just another episode.
Thank you for joining us for this special presentation from Dr. Leroy Hopkins. We hope you enjoyed the information Dr. Hopkins presented and that you learned something new. Again, we thank all of our sponsors, donors, and volunteers that keep Salisbury Township history alive and preserved for future generations.